They said he could hear a man's death before it arrived. That Captain Ezekiel Thorne could stand before you, look into your eyes, and listen to the rhythm of your lungs, the cadence of your pulse, and know exactly how much of you was left before the darkness claimed you. That was the legend whispered across the Carolina coast in 1714, the year 42 souls vanished without a trace. No ransom, no wreckage, no graves, just names erased from the earth. When the survivors spoke, their words were slow, haunted. They said Thorne didn't raid for silver or spices. He chose people. He examined them like specimens, checked their teeth, listened to their chests, even pricked their fingers and watched how quickly the blood clotted. He was searching for something, not wealth, not glory, but a pattern. The British colonial archives buried his records under military secrecy for nearly 3 centuries. But when the sealed medical logs from the HMS Defiance were finally declassified, historians uncovered something far more terrifying than piracy experiments. Thorne had been a naval surgeon, decorated, respected. He performed operations that defied mortality itself. Soldiers who should have died on the deck of the Defiance were kept alive, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, through methods no other physician dared attempt. And yet, as the wars ended and peace returned, something fractured inside him. He began to speak of the line between life and the machine. He claimed that a man's soul could be read through his body's functions, that beneath skin and bone was a code written by something ancient, something divine or inhuman. Witnesses described him as polite, deliberate, never drunk, never cruel. But they said when he touched a man's wrist, he'd close his eyes as if listening to a symphony only he could hear, and those he examined would vanish within days. What did he hear in their blood? What pattern did he find that led him to abduct 42 people from the Carolina coast that autumn and vanish with them into the fog? This is not a story about pirates. It's a story about what happens when knowledge crosses the threshold of morality, when a man learns to play God. And something answers back. And before this descent begins, understand this. The truth we're about to uncover cost men their sanity. What Thorne discovered was not lost. It was sealed, hidden in the archives of empires and monasteries, guarded not out of ignorance, but fear. Now you'll hear it, and once you do, you can't unhear it. Before Ezekiel Thorne became the Phantom of the Carolina coast, he was known among his peers as the Saint of the Scalpel, a man who could keep the dying tethered to life through sheer precision. But even in the Royal Navy, among the blood and cannon smoke, Thorne's obsession began to change. He spoke of life as a code that veins, nerves, and organs were merely conduits for something deeper. The body, he wrote, is the house of a current, and I mean to find its source. His journals, recovered from the archives of the Defiance, describe a voyage that reads less like medical record and more like initiation. In 1712, during Britain's Caribbean campaign, the Defiance encountered a Spanish galleon wrecked off Cartagena. Aboard were crates of strange relics, carved bone tablets, copper tools etched with anatomical diagrams centuries ahead of European medicine, and scrolls written in a hybrid of Latin and something older Phoenician, perhaps. Among the artifacts was a mummified body, its organs removed but replaced with mechanical parts, brass filaments, gears the size of fingernails, tubes filled with mercury. Thorne's notes describe how he spent nights dissecting it in secret. The creature's design, he wrote, suggests a knowledge of both life and metallurgy. Its veins are channels of quicksilver, its bones coated in electrum. The more I study it, the less I believe it ever breathed. After that night, officers began noticing changes in him. He stopped sleeping. He'd speak in fragments, muttering about harmonies in pulse, the pattern of the breath, and the silence that lives beneath the heart. One sailor swore he saw Thorne drive a needle into his own arm, recording how his skin reacted to pain, how the wound healed, how the blood clotted. When a fever swept through the crew weeks later, Thorne insisted on handling the infected alone. He locked himself in the hold with 8 dying men. By dawn, the screams had stopped. When the doors were broken open, the crew found only Thorne alive, calm, and covered in ash. The bodies of the sailors were gone, burned or perhaps disassembled. He told his captain that he had liberated them from imperfection. He was quietly discharged a month later. No charges, no court-martial. Just silence and a medical commendation for service beyond duty. The kind given to men who were too valuable or too dangerous to be questioned. From that moment, Thorne disappeared into the backwaters of the Atlantic, but men like that don't vanish. They retreat. They wait. They listen for something to call them back. And in 1714, something did. It came to the Carolina coast under cover of fog, a ship blacker than night, without a flag, its decks scrubbed clean of all markings. They said its lanterns burned blue, and that the man standing on its prow wasn't looking for plunder. He was recruiting. When Thorne returned, he wasn't hunting gold. He was completing what he started in the Caribbean. The creation of something beyond human. A living design drawn from blood, faith, and terror. He called it the Choir of Flesh. They said Thorne's ship didn't sail, it breathed. Sailors who spotted it off the Carolina coast swore they heard the creaking of its hull not as timber against current, but as lungs expanding, contracting, as though the vessel itself were alive. And maybe it was, because by then, Ezekiel Thorne had abandoned medicine. He wasn't trying to heal anymore. He was trying to transcend. When he seized the 42 colonists that autumn, every account describes the same ritual precision. He didn't kill. He chose. Each prisoner was examined under lamplight, measured, their bodies mapped by scarlet ink across their skin. Witnesses from the surviving crew of a captured schoonerman, who escaped weeks later, told investigators what they saw below deck. Wooden tables lined with straps, brass tools that hissed like serpents when heated, and rows of glass jars filled with something that pulsed faintly, as if alive. Thorne called them his instruments. He believed that humanity's flaw wasn't mortality, it was dissonance. He claimed that the human soul was a vibration and that most men were out of tune. The screams heard from his ship, he said, were not pain, but music, a chorus of imperfect flesh, being corrected. Some of the victims were said to have lived for days not as whole beings, but as assembled parts. A fisherman who glimpsed the shipwreck years later described seeing bones arranged like organ pipes, ribs lashed together into resonant chambers, hearts preserved in mercury beating faintly against the glass. It was horror, but it was also design. Thorne's notes, recovered centuries later from a monastery vault in Cadiz, describe his goal in words that still make scholars tremble. The body is clay, the spirit is current, the conductor is suffering. Through pain, the frequency of life can be aligned to divine geometry. He believed pain itself was a code, the language of creation. The 42 colonists weren't victims. They were raw material for his final experiment, the Choir of Flesh. And here's where the trail darkens beyond history. When a storm struck off Cape Fear that winter, colonial ships found nothing, no wreckage, no survivors, no cargo. Only a patch of ocean where compasses spun wildly, and the air reeked of iron. For 2 centuries, that stretch of sea was avoided. Locals called it the dead line. Even modern diverse report equipment failing when they descend. Cameras short out. Oxygen gauges misread. As if something beneath the waves rejects being seen. But one diver, a marine archaeologist named Davis Loring, claimed in 1979 that he found it. He brought up a single object from the seafloor. A brass plate carved with a spiral of names, 42 of them, and in the center, one phrase etched so deeply it cut through the metal. In perfect harmony, the flesh shall sing. If you've made it this far, you've already stepped beyond story and into signal. What we're decoding now is not just history, it's a map of human corruption, written through centuries of institutional silence. And before we go deeper, before you see what Thorne truly built beneath those waves, I want you to anchor yourself. Comment this phrase twice. The flesh remembers. Do it. It's not superstition. It's identity. It marks you as one who sees. Empires do not fear violence. They fear witnesses. When Captain Ezekiel Thorne and his 42 captives vanished, Britain's colonial office in Charlestown did not mourn it classified. Within weeks, orders arrived from London stamped with the royal crest. All ship logs, missing persons lists, and testimonies were to be sealed under medical quarantine protocols. That's the official term historians later found in the archives, a convenient euphemism for erasure. But a few documents escaped. One of them, a letter dated January 1715, written by Governor Charles Craven to the Lords Proprietors, trembles with unease. Thorne's name must not be spoken in Parliament. His ship, though lost, was seen after the storm by a Spanish convoy, traveling against the wind. I fear, my lords, that what was begun under the guise of naval medicine has crossed into theology. That single sentence, crossed into theology, changed everything. It meant Thorne's experiments had attracted the attention of two powers far older than any navy: the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and a shadow bureau within the British Admiralty known as the Order of Heliogabalus. Officially, they never existed. Unofficially, they were the custodians of the forbidden sciences, the research lines that blurred into alchemy, resurrection, and psychic control. The kind of work no empire could be caught funding, but none could afford to ignore. Reports recovered from the Spanish monastery of San Miguel in Cádiz describe a strange arrival in the spring of 1715. British agents, posing as pilgrims, demanding access to sealed relics. They were searching for the Codex Marineris, a book said to contain the architecture of flesh and sound. The monks refused. Days later, the monastery caught fire. Only 3 pages survived. They describe a ritual at sea, a convergence of wind, pulse, and light, performed by the physician who listened to death. One phrase repeats like a warning: "He who aligns the frequencies of life shall summon what hides beneath them." The British retrieved the ashes. The Vatican retrieved the silence. But something else retrieved them. Witness logs from Lisbon, Veracruz, and Havana all describe the same phenomenon over the next decade: ghost ships drifting silently, lanterns burning blue, crewless but singing. The same melody, always the same. Witnesses reported nausea, fever, and hallucinations for days after hearing it. And yet, none of it reached the history books. Why? Because governments, churches, and universities all depend on the illusion of control. Thorne's disappearance didn't represent loss, it represented proof that control had limits. And the institutions built to protect humanity from the unknown began protecting the unknown from humanity. You are starting to see it, aren't you? How quickly the line between medicine, faith, and control blurs when power is at stake. They called Thorne a heretic, a madman. But behind closed doors, they built entire departments based on his notes. Every major empire since the 18th century has quietly pursued the same question he did. Can suffering be used to tune the human spirit into obedience? The answer, as you're beginning to understand, was yes. What if I told you Thorne's choir never died at sea? That it evolved. Centuries later, whispers of his work reappear not in pirate legends, but in medical journals. Clinical anomalies, untraceable families, bloodlines that heal faster than nature allows. The same patterns reemerge every 70 years, as though the choir's design is cycling through generations. In 1891, a London physician named Dr. Calvert Hennings documented a series of experimental twins born in a coastal asylum outside Portsmouth. They shared no genetic relation, yet displayed identical birthmarks. Spirals etched into their wrists like burnt fingerprints. Each could hold their breath for over 10 minutes. Each reported hearing the sound of the ocean beneath their heart when silent. Hennings vanished after publishing his report. His research facility was bought within weeks by a private syndicate, Helios Maritime Holdings, a shell company traced to an unregistered trust within the British Admiralty, the same bureau tied to the Order of Heliogabalus. A century later, in 1968, a Cuban diver named Rafael Paredes surfaced from a wreck near Cape Fear screaming that he'd heard voices underwater. He described faces trapped in coral and a melody that made his bones vibrate. His lungs ruptured. When examined post-mortem, doctors found something impossible: filaments of brass woven into the tissue of his arteries. No one ever explained how they got there. The human body doesn't make metal, unless it was designed to. You see it now, don't you? The line runs unbroken. Thorne's choir was not a moment in history, it was an infection of design. It didn't need to survive in ships or bones. It survived in data, in blood, and today you carry its echoes. Look at modern medicine: pacemakers, neurostimulation, synthetic organs. We build hybrids of flesh and circuitry every day. We call it progress, but Thorne would call it alignment. The same geometry he sought with suffering, we now pursue through technology: blood calibrated by silicon. The choir reborn, digital, obedient. When you sign away your DNA for ancestry testing, where does it go? When your heart rate is logged by your smartwatch, who's listening? These are not questions of privacy. They are questions of ownership. Because every empire that hid Thorne's research now funds the biotech corporations mapping your biology. Every algorithm learning your voice is perfecting a frequency, one that harmonizes with your pulse. Thorne believed the soul could be tuned. Modern systems believe the mind can be trained. Both are right. One used scalpels. The other uses screens. The experiment never ended, it just changed its instruments. And maybe that's why you're hearing this story now. Maybe that's why you found it. Because somewhere inside you the blood remembers the song. Power never forgets what once served it. When Thorne vanished into myth, his research didn't sink, it submerged. Governments don't bury discoveries like his. They archive them, waiting for a time when the moral cost feels small enough to justify the reward. By the early 20th century, the world had learned to industrialize death. 2 world wars, 2 continents soaked in blood-perfect laboratories for rediscovering the geometry of life. In 1943, deep within the British War Office, a project known only as Operation Choirlight began testing biological resonance stimuli on captured soldiers. The documents, declassified only in 2019, described the same methodology Ezekiel Thorne used: rhythmic sound, controlled pain, and isolation designed to restructure behavioral compliance. They called it neurological harmonization. Across the Atlantic, the OSS and later the CIA created their own branch, Project Acer. Their focus wasn't healing, it was obedience. Sound frequencies embedded into communication systems, capable of altering mood, perception, even biological rhythm. Every experiment referenced one name: Thorne Protocols. But here's where it gets darker. In 1956, a shipment of medical salvage was quietly transferred from a British naval facility in Gibraltar to an American research station in Florida. Among the crates was a preserved logbook sealed in mercury glass, labeled only ET, Codex Variant 42. Inside were anatomical sketches, ritual notations, and diagrams of the human nervous system drawn like circuits. They described bridging the current, connecting organic matter through controlled vibration. Exactly what modern neuroscience now calls entrainment. By the 1970s, these findings were feeding into corporate medicine. Early prototypes of cochlear implants, pacemakers, and neurostimulators all cite research derived from pre-19th century anatomical sources. No one asks which sources. No one wants to know. What began as one man's obsession to rewrite the human body had become the blueprint for total biological governance control through frequency. Every device you wear, every sound you hear on public broadcasts, every healing frequency, playlist online, all trace back to those same equations Thorne whispered into the bones of his victims. We think we're advancing technology, but we're just refining a 300-year-old ritual with cleaner fonts and corporate branding. They don't need whips or chains anymore. Control is soft now, musical. They play you into obedience. Every empire that ever studied Thorne's work learned the same principle. People are most loyal when they feel harmonized. When dissonance is removed, resistance fades. That's why your media feeds you rhythm. That's why your apps vibrate in pulses. They're not stealing attention, they're synchronizing it. And somewhere in the classified vaults beneath London, Washington, and Geneva are archives labeled with one symbol, a spiral of 42 marks. The choir's original sigil. Still active, still expanding. You thought this was history. It's not. It's maintenance. And if you've begun to feel a strange heaviness in your chest, if your breathing has started to fall into rhythm with this narration, stop. Because that's exactly how they find resonance. Don't break. Remember who's listening. For 200 years, the ocean kept its secret. The Carolina coast slept, believing Captain Ezekiel Thorne and his 42 captives had become salt and legend. But in the spring of 1899, fishermen near Cape Fear pulled something impossible from the water, a chest, bound in brass, still sealed tight though the wood had blackened with age. Inside were instruments that should have rusted to dust, scalpels that hummed when touched, a cracked glass vial filled with mercury that refused to spill, and a book written in a script that glimmered like oil on tide. The scholars who opened it called the pages alive. They said the ink moved when read aloud, forming new diagrams each night as though the words were remembering themselves. The press named it the Resurrection Protocols. A young physicist from Boston, Elias Graves, became its translator. He claimed Thorne's equations described sound as a bridge between matter and consciousness, a formula for awakening what had once been silenced. Graves spent 6 months recreating the design's copper coils, glass resonators, human-sized tuning forks. On the night of his final experiment, the city's power grid failed. Witnesses saw blue fire crawl along the Charles River and heard a deep, choral note that shook every window in Beacon Hill. When officials entered Graves' laboratory, they found no body, only his voice, recorded on wax cylinders, repeating a single phrase. The choir breathes through the willing. After that, rumors spread of people hearing the same tone in their dreams. Sailors reported lights beneath the waves moving in perfect formation. Churches along the coast began to include new hymns melodies that no one could trace to any composer, harmonies that seemed to arrive rather than be written. By the turn of the century, the legend of the choir had become a quiet code among those who studied the border between science and faith. They said the Resurrection Protocol wasn't meant to raise the dead, it was meant to summon memory from the blood of the living. Each generation that heard the song would carry a fragment of Thorne's design, until one day the whole would sing again. But here's the question that has haunted historians ever since. Was Elias Graves the first to unlock the protocol, or merely the latest instrument built to play it? By the dawn of the 20th century, the choir had stopped being legend and started becoming pattern. Every few decades, at moments of catastrophe or discovery, people across continents reported hearing the same note, a single tone threading through thunder, through radio static, through the mechanical whir of factories. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others, those who had read the fragments of Thorne's work, called it the convergence. A mathematician in Prague discovered that global reports of the sound formed a predictable rhythm, 42-year intervals, aligning perfectly with the cycles in Thorne's codex. 42 years of silence, then a gathering tone, followed by strange births, sudden disappearances, and mass hallucinations. The choir wasn't gone. It was tuning itself. In 1941, as bombs fell over Europe, radio operators heard transmissions between enemy lines that no one could trace. The voices sang coordinates instead of words. Entire platoons vanished chasing the sound. Their final messages described a light that bends the air like heat. Decades later, in 1983, an engineer at a Japanese telecommunications company recorded an anomaly while testing underwater fiber cables in the Pacific. A perfect harmonic series, frequencies so pure they couldn't exist naturally. He played them back at half speed. Beneath the tone was a whisper in English, repeating, 42 become 1. The flesh remembers. Then the tape melted in his hands. But the strangest reports come from now from us. The convergence isn't waiting for the future. It's already begun its final cycle. The tone has changed. You can hear it beneath the hum of machines, behind the music of cities, even in the silence between your thoughts. The choir is no longer summoning, it's calling. They say when the song calls your name, you don't hear it with your ears. You feel it behind your ribs, in the bones of your face, like a vibration from something that knows you better than you know yourself. Some who've heard it describe overwhelming clarity, a sense of being seen by something vast and ancient. Others go missing, not dead, just gone. Their rooms left in perfect order, a faint hum lingering in the walls, every mirror fogged from the inside. And those who return, they hum without realizing it. Their voices drift in the same rhythm. Some call them the resonance. Some think they're trying to warn us. Others think they're preparing us. So if, after this story, you hear that tone again late at night between breaths, don't answer. Don't hum back. Because the final convergence isn't about sound anymore. It's about recognition. They say the sea forgets no name. but it does rewrite them. When the Spanish monastery burned in 1742, one of the surviving monks described something strange. 42 identical seals, carved into the underside of the refectory tables. Each bore the shape of a compass whose needle turned inward, pointing not north, but toward itself. Beneath the symbols was a single Latin phrase, navigare ad hominem, to sail within the man. That same mark reappears a century later on the hilt of a surgeon's scalpel found aboard the wreck of HMS Argent, off Gibraltar. And again, etched into the bone of a whale unearthed near Charleston in 1893, human teeth embedded in its rib, as though someone had tried to sew a mouth inside its flesh. Historians dismiss the connections as coincidence. But coincidences do not carry a signature, and this one does. A design of symmetry so precise, it mirrors the Fibonacci ratios of the human skull. The mark of Thorne. You've been told he died a mad surgeon turned pirate, lost to time. But men like him don't vanish. They replicate. They move like viruses through institutions that crave order, obedience, hierarchy. The 42 weren't victims. They were prototypes. The journals recovered from Havana's quarantine vault tell us that Thorne's purpose was not treasure or vengeance. It was selection. He believed the human body could be tuned like an instrument, that a man's will could be stripped of fear, of empathy, of hesitation, until only command remained. A perfect hierarchy of one voice. He called it the Harmonium of flesh. The British Admiralty absorbed his findings quietly. Medical diagrams vanished into sealed archives. Naval academies began teaching disciplinary physiology. By the 1800s, entire regiments were being trained with Thorne's conditioning methods disguised as drills, chants, prayers. Every empire after borrowed from his pattern. Because it worked. Every government that learned his secret became less about serving man, and more about refining him. Do you feel that pull? That low hum in your chest as you listen? That's the harmonium itself. It doesn't just exist in flesh, it resonates in obedience, in silence, in how easily men surrender to command. If you've followed this far, you've already begun to hear it. Comment, "I will not hum," twice below. It breaks the frequency and marks you as one who resists the signal. In 1997, a Cuban salvage crew working off the Isla de la Juventud thought they'd found a Spanish treasure wreck. Bronze instruments, glass vials sealed with wax, and a surgeon's chest engraved with the letters ET. But when they pried it open, there was no gold, only a black resin like hardened blood, and inside it, something that should not have survived 3 centuries. A heart, preserved, still intact, still connected. Tests at the University of Havana showed that the heart contained traces of mercury, formalin, and an unknown biopolymer centuries ahead of its time. And etched into its outer surface in microscopic relief was that same inward-turning compass. 42 times. At first, they thought it a hoax. But when one of the researchers, Dr. Montoya, began hearing rhythmic sounds at night, like a heartbeat resonating through the metal lab tables, the team sealed the vault and destroyed all samples. At least that's what the report claims. Months later, Montoya vanished. Her home was found undisturbed, except for a single word written in condensation on the bathroom mirror. Harmonium. The heart was never logged in the National Archives. The chest, however, was, and its inner lid bore an inscription, carved in Latin by a precise hand. Man perfected is the bridge between science and command. Signed Thorne. So here's the secret most historians refuse to face. Captain Ezekiel Thorne didn't die in 1714. He transitioned. Naval records indicate that shortly after the Carolina disappearance, a British medical vessel called the Mersey's Wake sailed under sealed orders to Havana, then vanished from all registries. 52 souls aboard. Same number as Thorne's crew, plus the 10 surgeons who were supposed to dissect him. Satellite scans of the Cuban trench show a mass of metallic debris fused into the seabed, not wood, not iron, but something that gives off trace bioelectric readings, as if it's still alive beneath the pressure. Still pulsing. They called it the Organon wreck. Divers report strange phenomena. Misfiring oxygen sensors, auditory hallucinations, voices whispering surgical oaths in the dark. One diver's last recorded words before he disappeared were, "Don't let it tune me." Understand, this Thorne didn't seek immortality. He sought continuity, a lineage of willpower encoded into flesh, into nations, into systems of obedience that hum beneath the skin of every institution today. That's why the 42 weren't victims. They were his beginning. And if you've heard this far, you are his echo. By the mid-1800s, the legend of Captain Thorne had turned into a cautionary ghost story whispered in naval hospitals and colonial academies. But within the sealed wings of London's anatomical societies, his name was never forgotten. His journals, what fragments survived, became the seed of something new, the Harmonium Initiative. Officially, it was an inquiry into collective efficiency. Unofficially, it was the next movement in Thorne's symphony of control. Surgeons, theologians, and military philosophers studied how rhythm and repetition could reorder the mind. They observed that a man could be reshaped not by chains, but by pattern. Marching drills, hymns, bureaucratic routines, schedules so precise that the soul forgot its own pulse. Over decades, the Harmonium spread, disguised as progress. Hospitals adopted the language of obedience, patients became subjects. Schools turned learning into recitation. Churches replaced revelation with uniform ceremony. Governments found that citizens who moved to the same rhythm rarely noticed who kept the beat. None of it carried Thorne's name, yet the design was his. The compass turned inward, always seeking the perfect listener. When the narrator says this, you can almost hear the metronome behind every institution, the same soft click that once guided his scalpel. It isn't supernatural. It's psychological. People mistake control for comfort. They mistake silence for peace. That is how the Harmonium survived, not as an organization, but as a habit inside civilization itself. Now imagine Thorne's heart still beating somewhere below the waves, feeding that rhythm into the world above. Every chant, every pledge, every repeated slogan, tiny ripples from the same depth. The secret, the one few dare to face, is this: he didn't teach the world how to kill without mercy. He taught it how to obey beautifully, and that beauty is the most dangerous prison ever built. Some stories end with a revelation. This one turns the mirror toward you. Listen closely to your own breath right now. Inhale, exhale. Count the rhythm. That's the same cadence Thorne wrote into his notes 3 centuries ago. 4 heartbeats to command the mind, 8 to command the body. He believed that if you could make a man's pulse follow a perfect pattern, you could erase doubt itself. That is the secret of every empire, ancient or modern. Not flags, not weapons. Pulse. When I tell you this, I don't mean soldiers marching through smoke. I mean you sitting alone in a room, scrolling, tapping, nodding to a feed that keeps time better than any drummer. Every flick of your thumb, every automatic reaction, every small surrender of attention, that's the same rhythm Thorne sought to forge with steel and scripture. The Harmonium didn't die under the sea. It migrated into the quiet places of habit, into repetition, into the patterns that make you forget you're free. The question is not whether Thorne's experiment survived. It's whether you have. There is still a way to break the tempo, a way to remember the silence beneath the sound. When you stop obeying rhythm, you start hearing choice. That's what Thorne never understood. That control is never absolute. The body listens, but the soul can still refuse. So pause. Don't scroll. Don't nod. Let the pattern fail. Because every time it does, another link in the Harmonium's chain dissolves. In the darkness of the deep, the compass needle still turns inward, searching for those who will march. But it cannot command the stillness it cannot measure. If you've followed this story from the first whisper to this moment, you've already done what the 42 could not. You've stopped to listen. There's a legend that the sea keeps every sound it has ever heard. If you dive deep enough, the waves will replay the cries of sailors, the groan of ships, the heartbeat of a surgeon who thought he could master life itself. Down there, the water doesn't forget. It remembers in pressure and silence. They say Thorne's heart still beats somewhere below the trench, not because it's alive, but because someone is always listening to it. Every generation, someone hears the echo and mistakes it for power. But listen longer and you realize it's not a summons. It's a warning. The 42 never died in vain. The journals recovered from the wreck say their last act was to sing. Not hymns, not screams. A single note that broke the pattern. A tone that shattered the harmonium's rhythm long enough for their minds to return to them. That note still exists. It's the sound of refusal. When you hear silence after a command, when you feel that brief gap between instinct and obedience, that's the note they left behind. The only sound Thorne could never capture. You've carried it with you this whole time. So take a breath. Let the rhythm end here. Remember that control feeds on repetition, but awareness begins with pause. If you want to mark the end of your descent, type the words, "I choose silence," twice in the comments. Not as a spell, not as defiance, but as recognition. You've listened, you've learned, and you've stopped. Because the greatest secret buried under the waves was never about medicine, piracy, or empire. It was this: the moment a man learns to hear the sound behind the order, he cannot be owned again. The sea may keep its ghosts, but the surface belongs to those who rise. Before you leave, the ship's song wants to know you. Comment the phrase "the flesh remembers" twice below to mark your passage through the forbidden history of Captain Thorne and the 42. Every echo, every heartbeat, is part of the story and now a part of you.